So first, just tell me a little bit about the your background with disability rights.
Okay, so I have been, uh, well, first of all, I identify as a person with a disability. When I was little, I had polio, which as a young person, you probably don't even know what that is because we've eradicated that in the
Yes.
United States for the most part, which is great. But when I was born, it was towards the end of, or towards it was the beginning of when they were doing the vaccinations. They were still not available across the country. They were piloting it in different parts of the country. So I was part of that last group. So I grew up with a physical disability. I kind of I never intended to be in the disability work. I went to college and like a lot of my people my age at the time, I fell into this work because I started doing a job and I just found out I loved it. I started as a direct support professional, which is a person who assists people with disabilities in their homes to lead a better quality of life. And so I just loved it and I stayed in it, went on to get my master's degree in it. At the time I got my master's degree in special education, but I've moved into administrative roles. I was the executive director for the ARC of Howard County for 21 years. The ARC is the nation's largest advocacy organization for and on behalf of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We also at the ARC Howard did services, so we did residential services and a wide array of services. I was in that role for quite a long time, and then when the previous governor took office, he asked me to serve as the secretary for the Department of Disabilities. And when Governor Moore was elected, he asked me to stay on in this role. So it's kind of that's my history. And I worked throughout my career, my focus was always on community-based services. So making sure that people with disabilities and their families had the right resources in place so that they could live integrated lives in the community and fulfilling lives in the community, working, having control over their housing, having adequate resources for transportation, being part of their community in whatever way they choose to define that. That's really what our job was, is to support them to do that. I guess one of my proudest things, the things that I'm proudest about is that when I was new to the field, when I was a young professional, there were still thousands of people being institutionalized, which was horrendous.
Yeah.
And I worked my entire career to help close institutions and bring those people out into the community, back to their home communities, back to communities that they chose to live in. And in Maryland, we were very successful and did close. We still have two very small institutions that combined, they're under 100 people at this point, and there are thousands of people in the community that are being supported. So, that trajectory went from big institutions, little community stuff, to completely the opposite direction.
Yeah. Well, how did your background with having a disability and working at the ARC and working to close institutions make you want to be Secretary of Disabilities? I know you were appointed to the role, but...
Yeah. So I was interested in doing it, first of all, because it was sort of late in my career, and it was an opportunity for me to still continue to learn and to grow, because my whole career had been focused on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the Department of Disabilities is cross disabilities work, and so we really reach out and develop relationships and with with any kind of, disability community, blind and low vision, deaf and hard of hearing, the autism community, people with physical disabilities, people with traumatic brain injuries, people that have behavioral health needs. So, that to me was attractive because I thought I've been doing it for this smaller group, which isn't really smaller, but I was doing this work here, and it expanded my ability to make a difference. I also had never worked for state government. I had always worked for private nonprofit organizations. I had never wanted to work for state government. But when the opportunity came up, I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see what kind of a difference I can make inside state government. So that was another kind of attractive idea, something that I wanted to explore.
Yeah. So throughout your entire career and in working with people with disabilities, what have you done to make Maryland a more equitable place in general for people with disabilities and specifically for children with disabilities?
Yeah, so most of my work has been done with adults. I'm just going to say that. Mm-hmm. Although a lot of the work that I have done as secretary has focused on transition age youth. Yeah. So that would be 14 to 21, or some people even say 14 to 26. But, so the work that we are doing here in the department, for example, we are working with local nonprofits and businesses to bring on board people with disabilities into work placements, into employment, with the right supports in place, so that they have the possibility of financial stability. That's been some of my most rewarding work, is watching how we can meet the needs of people with disabilities who want to go on to college but really don't have the resources or the supports that they need to really be successful, trying to figure that out with state agency partners and also with local communities, and local school systems. But also, how do you help those young people who don't want to go on to college or can't go on to college? How do you help them find a career?
Yeah.
So we do an awful lot of work in that space, where we're working with with families to really encourage them to have very high expectations for their children with disabilities, as well as with employers to know that this is really an untapped resource for them. And especially today, where employers are just really finding it difficult to find enough employees, we have this whole community that hasn't really been tapped.
Yeah.
So that's been one of the most, and I think the most equitable, because equity is, to me, having the ability to live your life like everybody, having the ability to have a dream for your life and to be able to successfully accomplish that.
Yeah.
Regardless of what kinds of supports need to be in place, those supports should be in place so that you can achieve those dreams. Yeah. And that's what we find for people with disabilities. Their dreams are not any different than anybody else's. And so we have to figure out how to make those things happen for people.
Definitely. Yeah. So when you are working on things like that, have you faced any major challenges or pushbacks in securing the rights for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I still think there's a lot of stigma out there, and low expectations. I think that people think, I know that when we talk to families, for example, they sometimes don't see the possibilities for their children, or they're worried about that. They're worried about them being out there in the world, and what's going to happen to them. And it's very hard to be a parent of a child, especially with a significant disability, because there's so much that you want to protect. You want to make sure that they're taken care of. And some of these things that we're talking about, these achieving your dreams, that's risky. And it's hard I'm a parent myself. I'm not a parent of a disabled child, but I know how I felt when he was growing up, and you want to protect them. And so I know that, and having talked with hundreds and hundreds of parents over the years and supported them, I know that that's a concern. But, so that I think is challenging. Having the right supports in place and really educating employers that making accommodations for people with disabilities doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Immediately employers sometimes think, oh, well, I can't hire somebody like that because they're going to require this and it's going to cost so much money.
Yeah. And
most accommodations, really, the data shows that most accommodations are very low cost. And so I think, fighting that or dispelling those stigmas and those myths about people with disabilities has been challenging.
Yes. Is there any specific legislator you think should be proposed that would help people with disabilities in Maryland?
We have a very responsive legislature, and we are always coming up with ideas. Yeah. They're pretty open to hearing them. And our governor is very visionary. Governor Moore is very visionary. And, when he says that no one's going to be left behind, he really means that. And that includes people with disabilities in Maryland. And so he's very supportive of any changes that we can come up with that will help better support people with disabilities in Maryland. I will say that one of the needs that I see in Maryland is acute need, and it's not just for people with disabilities, but it does impact disproportionately people with disabilities, is the need for affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And I would add to that accessible housing, because it's if you've got one but not the other, and you're a person with a physical disability needing access, it could be affordable, but maybe you can't live there. Yeah. But we have both. We have a lack of affordable housing and a lack of accessible housing.
Well, my last question for you is, how can able-bodied Marylanders such as myself support disabled Marylanders socially and in a legal sense?
Well, I see a great, I have seen a great change from the time that I was little and going to school, and the schools nowadays. Mm-hmm. In that, we've spent a lot of time and energy and focus on including students with disabilities in general education, and figuring out ways to do that so that it benefits the whole classroom and the whole school. And I think you do that, and students like you who are young, you've gone to school with children with disabilities your whole life now. And so it's not like, there's a different person there. Yeah. It's, that they're part of your friend, they're your friends and your neighbors and so I think that has changed a lot, but it still needs to keep changing. Mm-hmm. Because we still see students with disabilities being bullied more frequently, more often. That's the same word, but more intensely than students without disabilities. And so I think what I would encourage is that we continue the efforts of including students with disabilities meaningfully in regular classrooms,
Mhm.
And that because you are going to be the employer in a few years who are going to say, we're going to hire people with disabilities because I know they have talents and skills to give us, and they have, and they're out there, and we want to match up. I mean, you're going to be open to that because of who you are and what, how you've been educated. We just need to continue to pursue that. It starts when you're young, right? You learn to be accepting or not accepting, and so I think that's where we should be putting our efforts.
Certainly, yes. Well, that's all my questions. Thank you so
Okay.
much for agreeing to meet with me. It's
I'm
such an
so
honor to
glad
get
we
to meet
finally
you.
made this happen.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.